My name is Billy Wimsett. I am so proud to be the executive director of Movement Voter Project. And this is actually the first call that I didn't uh, curate myself, or I wasn't the major curator of. Elizabeth usually creates the deck for us. And in the course of talking about this call, Elizabeth Fernandez, who you're gonna hear from next, um, was like so passionate about it. And we kind of looked at each other and I was like, do you want to curate this call? Because I think you have like a real vision for it. And she was like, yeah, I could do that, And I was asking her like right before the call, are you ready? And she was like, I was born ready. So you all, if you don't know Elizabeth Fernandez, our communications director, you're in for a real treat meeting her and the rest of our team. And I just want to say a couple things by way of framing. We're all holding three huge things right now. The election, arguably the most consequential election of our lives, or as consequential certainly as any election we could ever have. The pandemic, which has wreaked so much havoc and death and trauma on so many people all over the world, including many loved ones. Just sending huge hugs to anyone who's dealing with health and losing people. And oh, I'm getting emotional. Yeah, so we're holding the election, we're holding the pandemic, and we're holding being in the midst of one of the most important justice movement moments in our country's history, and certainly in recent memory. And there's a lot of pain associated with that, and there's a lot of possibility. So holding all of these things at once, including and in addition to like everything we're holding in our lives, is a lot. So just all of us, family at the Movement Voter Project, to all of you and your families, thank you for coming and spending time with us, and let's hold these things together. And it's really just been over the last week. We're 15 weeks out from the start of early vote. And as we know, elections are no longer on November 3rd. They basically start now with making sure everyone's registered, making sure people are signed up for mail-in voting. And early vote starts a month out from the election. And in this election in particular, it's not 5 months from now, it is now. We are starting GOTV now. And I realized I had like an epiphany this week that for the last 3.5 years, I've been living in a heightened state of just fear and anxiety and trauma because of the Trump administration and every terrible thing that has wrought. And for the first time, and my mentality has been just like, it's a 50-50 election. It could come down to 1,000 votes, one vote in one state. And we just have to, hunker down and do everything we can to make sure we flip that one vote or those 1,000 votes, or, but it's been a really fear-based vision. And for the first time this week, I was like, wow, we could actually win. We could actually win the Senate. We could actually have a wave. We could actually flip a whole bunch of local stuff that we didn't. This could be a repeat of 2018. And I don't want to get overconfident. That is the last thing that we should do right now. But, in addition to stopping a terrible thing, I've started to feel a little bit of, let myself feel a little bit of a sense of hope that there is a possibility that we could have a wave that could set us up to make the 2020s a progressive decade. So now I am not only putting my mind, body, and soul and resources, everything I've got, into stopping a terrible thing, I'm putting it all into making a brighter future for my children and for everyone I love and care about. And so I just want to share that sense of hope that we have to fight forward for this future we want, and we can have it. We can have that. So I'm going to just go ahead and pass this on to my incredible colleague, Elizabeth Fernandez, who comes to us from Florida Immigrant Coalition and SEIU and whole professional career in communications. We're so lucky to have her in leading this, and you're going to meet some really incredible folks from our team. And I just have to say how lucky I feel to work with this MVP team. It just keeps getting better and better. Like the people we have on the team, and we're just really starting to get a flow. And so welcome everyone. And Elizabeth, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Billy, thank you so much for the intro. Let's move on to the agenda, so we can talk a little bit about what we're going to be going over today. So first of all, thank all of you for coming. The link to invite folks, it's in the chat, so please feel free to invite anybody that you know. And we are going to be talking really with our team, because our team has been doing a lot of really amazing, powerful work. What has been happening in this moment is in so many ways a proof of concept for the work that we've been doing. And it really shows how our partners are able to stand up and lead, because this uprising that's happening did not happen overnight. It happened because of the work that groups across the country have been doing. And the elections, we have had record-breaking vote by mail turnout in a lot of different states. That is because of the work that our groups have been doing, preparing for this, preparing for anything that could happen. And so I'm really excited. I want to jump right in, and I'm going to introduce next Montague, who is our local Justice Project Director. And yeah, I want to let him speak on some of the amazing work that has been happening across the country, both before this election and during this season.
Ready? Okay. Good afternoon, team. As Elizabeth shared, my name is Montague Simmons. I'm joining you today from St. Louis, Missouri. Depending on who you talk to, St. Louis could be represented as the Midwest, or up south, or the gateway to the West, or Dred Scott City for some of us. I came to MVP and the local Justice Project in no small part due to my connection to the Ferguson uprisings and subsequent work. In the wake of Mike Brown's murder, specifically at the hands of police officer Darren Wilson, the Organization for Black Struggle, where I was a chairperson at the time, convened several partners, including Missourians Organizing to Reform and Empower, to build support for the people who had actually been activated in the streets. In that space, we developed shared demands, communications, rapid response, in support of the actual ongoing protest. The formation actually would become what we know now as the Don't Shoot Coalition. Now, from the moment that Mike died, people in the community completely understood that they weren't going to get justice from Bob McCulloch, who was at the time the prosecutor. The governor's unwillingness to replace him with a special prosecutor just made it clear to folks that if we want justice when these things happen, we have to seize more political power. And in the immediate aftermath, in the months and years that followed, the groups that actually undergirded Don't Shoot led campaigns that would help elect Kim Gardner in the city and eventually defeat Bob McCulloch in the county, electing Wesley Bell as the first prosecutor in more than 20 years. So the theory that actually underlines the local Justice Project aims to advance a broad strategy supporting the development of localized united fronts or alliances and building more strategic alignment in deconstructing the carceral state and mass criminalization. So over the last 6 years, in addition to what we're all now really seeing perfectly nationally, in terms of like the movement for Black Lives, we've actually been watching in cities around the country experiment with this model, from not just St. Louis, but to New York, to Long Island, to Chicago. We've actually seen organizations come together and take on the carceral state. Now, for organizations that we work with, this does not mean just traditional vote work. It also means engaging infrequent voters. It means deep political education and building connections and commitment to a larger vision of what justice is, more so than just the candidates. And specifically in the cities I named, it's those visions that actually tend to win, even more so than the candidates, who in some cases were not even very popular, just to name it. So to back up and talk about the moment that we're in, like first let's talk about how we entered 2020. Like this is 6 years in the wake of the actual uprisings. And honestly, like our vision was deeply under attack, along with that first cohort of prosecutors that we saw in all these cities. They found themselves both worn and continually dealing with pressure. Even though the public supported the vision, that didn't always translate into electoral victories outside of justice. So we could win a prosecutor, but then we'd see a pushback in other spaces, and the public wasn't always backing us up. So even with that growing opposition, it's been easy for me to actually identify and find like new spaces, new formations, and organizations that were convening themselves and prepared to interject themselves electorally. Now, it's worth noting specifically, like here, that many of the organizations who are now leading this work didn't exist in 2014. And many of them also held severe tensions with the idea of electoral work. These organizations are now leading new iterations of what the work could look like. If you need a witness, honestly, look back to what happened this year in Chicago. A lot of our folks that we actually relate to deeply had all but given up on the race, but come election day, they saw victory. So moving forward, I'm gonna ask that we go and take a step back into St. Louis. Let's look at, I guess, the broad map so folks can actually see where we are. And as you can see, one, there are dozens of organizations around the country that are actually doing this. And I'm gonna start with where I live, just to put it in context for you. It's where we stopped off in St. Louis. Today, the organizing hasn't stopped. In fact, it's gotten sharper. The political analysis is sharper. In 2014, and as I talk about cities, most of the words I'm using, they're not just my own. I'm taking this directly from what folks have told us and what they're actually sharing in their organizing work. As organizers, this was a we called for reforms that actually poured resources into a broken system. That meant we called for the body cameras. We wanted more training. And others like small scale changes that we now know didn't end the violence that we continually face day to day. Now, as organizers in the city, they're directly calling for divestment from the carceral systems and reinvestment into communities that have actually suffered from benign neglect. Today, those organizations like Action St. Louis, like OBS, like many that do exist now and some that didn't, like Action didn't get founded, I think, until 2016 and 17. We Power was also founded in 2016. The campaign table is still made up of a majority of people that were there doing Ferguson, but it's now a very new and energized space. So the work in St. Louis in some ways is a testament to what this infrastructure could look like and shifting from just being reform minded to actually doing transformative work. It actually are now shifting like deeply into decarceration and ending cash bail. Before I came to MVP, I was directly part of a campaign to decarcerate a local jail. When the campaign started off, the workhouse in the city, which is a horrible place, held more than 600 folks in the building. Today, it's down to 92. That's power that we couldn't have imagined in 2013. Right now, participating with that table, like I mentioned before, Action St. Louis, Arch City Defenders, the Bail Project, OBS, Missouri Faith Voices, Metropolitan Congregations United, We Power St. Louis, Empower Missouri, Nationally Working Families Party, and Color of Change. Now, Missouri is just one example, and we could talk much deeper at some other time. But if we want to look at what inspiration has done, let's turn to Florida. So Florida has also a very interesting story to tell, in that their incarceration rate is 19% higher than the national average. In 1970, the prison population since 1970, the prison population has increased nearly 4 times the growth of overall population. So what that means is Florida is spending $2.4 billion a year just on the Department of Corrections. That's about twice as much as the budget for the state's 28 public colleges, and has almost twice as many people in prison as New York, which is the fourth largest state in the country. Racial disparities there are endemic at all phases of Florida's criminal justice system. Black Floridians only make up 47% they make up 47% of the prison population compared to just 17% of the state's overall population. And they're twice as likely to be shot by police after being pulled over for a traffic violation, 4 times as likely to be shot in the back. Black residents are 3 times more likely to face drug-free zone enhancement charges and spend double the time in lockup as whites convicted of the same charges. So the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, FRRC, and the Dream Defenders have actually brought together a coalition of state-based and national orgs, including Faith in Florida, New Florida Majority, Florida Immigrant Coalition, Organized Florida, and then the nationals like Color of Change and Working Families Party, to advance their own collective strategy around the 2020 races, specifically to dismantle mass incarceration in Florida. Now, as the 3rd largest state in the country, the nation's largest swing state, doing this successfully will not only impact millions of folks in the South, but also drive this narrative about the impact of policies like the 1994 crime bill. 2020 creates the potential for a brand new dynamic for the state. It's also going to be the first election after Amendment 4 that created a path for 1.4 million citizens to actually register to vote and participate in elections. And that's a powerful new constituency that's been done by grassroots organizing. They set specific goals that are, for 2020 is 1, a vision of decarceration and divesting resources from criminalization and investing in community. And then 2, ending cash bail and other reforms to pretrial detention. Other issues that they're looking to directly confront include local elections, ICE holds, direct file of juveniles in adult court, and reforms around driver's license suspensions for those with fees and fines and legalizations. Now, to name it, they're working in, I think the overall list is probably 6 different jurisdictions, going for a number of different electoral victories. Now we went big, let's step back and look small. Let's take a look at Michigan. I say small, but Michigan actually has the 9th largest state prison population. In 2015, they had 42,628 folks behind bars. It's amongst the harshest and most oppressive criminal justice system in any nation. The average prison time served in Michigan is the longest in the nation, with more than 1/3, like just under, actually it's almost 40% of the prison population serving a minimum sentence of 15 years or longer. Of the 3,000 plus jurisdictions in the state, Wayne County, which is Detroit, ranked 17th for sending people to prison. That means 2,819 folks alone in 2014. 2019, Michigan Liberation started organizing in Detroit community for prosecutor accountability. During their listening sessions, people began to share stories about their impact, their concerns, and their ideas on the value of a county prosecutor. So last year, they actually partnered with local organizations, Detroit Action, We the People, and 5 national partners, including Working Families Party, Color of Change, Us at MVP, Mass Liberation, and the Advancement Project, to form what they're calling Wayne County for the People. And over the last 2 years, they've actually begun to work really closely with that community to build a platform around which they hope to actually fight during the next cycle. That platform articulates demands that include the reduction of incarceration, treating kids like kids instead of moving them up to adult court, rehabilitation, not punishment, invest, divest, which is the demand you constantly hear right now around defund, and then a demand to increase fairness and transparency. Now again, this is the work that was happening before we entered 2020. And can we just glance back at the map real quick? Because I just want folks to see the scale of it. I'm looking at 3 sites, but we're talking to a number of other sites. around the country. And this just represents some of the folks that we've talked to up through Q1. There are a lot of other organizations that we didn't get to touch further west. Once Q2 hit, and most of you know, like, we started hearing about COVID in March, and we had to begin shifting our conversations. Organizations began to shift, not from and away from doing the electoral, but in response to needs of the communities in which they live. In some cases, that meant mutual aid. In some cases, it actually meant doing rallies and food. But then in the wake of that, we also saw the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. Remember, these organizations are grassroots. So where they've actually traditionally worked has been in the streets, and this moment called them back there. That didn't stop their electoral plans. Organizations like Michigan Liberation and like Florida for Freedom, which is the coalition that actually has been advanced with their coalition, have actually been doing virtual conversations with their folks, both around the election, but around this current moment. Now, as we talk about the now, and I know Billy kind of opened the door to this, what we're seeing is not only unexpected, but it's unprecedented for most of us. Because, like I said, 6 years ago, where I lived, we were still talking about putting money back into these systems in terms of body cameras, in terms of training for police. And as we began to explore it both locally and then looking nationally, we became clear, both as local orgs and also within the constellation of orgs that exist in the movement for Black Lives, that the call was to defund. But we knew that in most local jurisdictions, that's a hard conversation to have, in part because the communities that most of our folks live in aren't necessarily safe. So the fact that at this moment, defund the police has been the cry, not just from the org, but from the streets, means that everybody's political imagination has moved in a significant way, and has moved faster than we've seen over the last 6 years. What does that mean for us? It means that victory for us is not just going to be in defunding the police. This is also an opportunity for us to really build those organizations and build an ecosystem to build political power in ways that, honestly, a matter of months ago was beyond our own imagination. Political power will allow them to defend their wins. Political power is what allows them to continue to create and build a mass to make those visions real. Organizations and activists are already beginning to experience backlash in this moment. And I think most of you know, like most of us actually saw directly what happened in Washington, D.C. in the face of protesters literally being tear gassed in order to move. They didn't want to hear the demand. So right now, part of what's actually happening is those orgs are moving those people not just to fight around people being killed, but around a demand to participate. For us, that means that when we're having conversations with those folks, we're not just looking for our normal stats. We're not just asking them, how many voters have you touched? We're not just asking them, who are you canvassing today? And that's not just in the wake of the uprising, but also the reality of COVID. What we've learned over the course of time is that voters that are actually activated and organized will have a stronger tendency to vote. They will show up. But it also means that we actually have to give those organizations the room to do the work that we know, the work that we know very deeply and in our bones. People have often compared this moment to 1968. And one, I think that's something very real, especially for those of you who join us, not just as organizers, but as donors to this moment. Part of what's actually happened here is we're actually watching the seeds of the uprisings, from Ferguson to Occupy to the banning the importations of our immigrant brothers and sisters, to the actual backlash against Trump and the Women's March, which today is still the largest gathering that we've ever seen. All that energy is landed now in this space where we all face a reckoning. There's a reckoning not just against our opposition, but against us, that calls us to do everything that we can in this moment. In '68, while people were in the streets, Nixon won. COINTELPRO thrived, and many of those organizing formations got disrupted. that also led to the birth of neoliberalism in our political space. And personally, and at first I wrestled with whether to even say this, but I don't just harken back to 68. I also look back to 1919. In the wake of the Great Flu pandemic, we also saw a massive wave of organizing protests in the street, not only in regards to the flu, but in regards to the Great Depression. And even more so, we also saw the birth of the New Deal. But in this moment, I'm gonna call you even further back to the wake of Reconstruction. In Reconstruction, many folks actually point to that 12 years as a lost opportunity for us. This reckoning actually calls everyone to actually assess how we're living, not just in terms of where you're spending money, are you a racist, do we still need police? But it asks us, is this the type of society that we want to live in? And when we talk about this, we're not just talking about for us the call of our ancestors who've actually bled, died, and been lost in the struggle, but the cost to future generations, the folks who are actually watching us now from 10, 20, 40, 50, and more years from now, and asking, what did we do in this moment? How did you show up? Were you there? This is not just about the presidential cycle. And make no mistake, we need to defeat the incumbent. We need to defeat Donald Trump. But it's not just about that. The question is not just what you're going to invest now, but it's what's going to happen in 2021. What's going to happen to these organizations in 2022, 2025? Before, we saw in the wake of Reconstruction, that was the birth of mass incarceration. We're still working to deconstruct that to this day. That's exactly what we're fighting right now. We have an opportunity to not just, we can't go small scale. This is no time to actually redefine this just so we get the win. We need everybody all in ways that you've never actually dreamed of. We need you not just to stay woke, but we need you on the front lines. Organizations have honestly been injured. Working directly with M4BL, we've seen the government literally snatching packages. We've watched people be snatched from the streets, thrown in jail for ridiculous reasons. Folks who weren't even on front lines, but just literally tweeted about what's going on in the streets. There will be, and there is already a backlash. The backlash will get worse. And honestly, we haven't seen the last of bloodshed. We haven't seen the last of the violence that's going to be inflicted. But the only way we can actually resist this and make the vision real, make the transformation real, is if you put in for the long term. You have an opportunity right now. There is no tomorrow. The only thing we have is today. We need you to step up and stand with us. What I've shown you before is that's the work that everyone was doing before this. In the midst of all the street action, in the midst of all the regular protests and everything else, they were already doing the work at the polls, and they're still doing the work to bring people into power. But they need your help, and they're gonna need more. With that, I'm gonna step back and turn it back to Elizabeth because I know there's more to share. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I am just really so honored to work with you, Montague, always, and so honored just to really learn, to really be in a position of learning from the a powerful work of people, and also by letting the most impacted lead to really change this. You know, Alex, can we go to our Black-led organizing fund slide? Can we share that, please, right now? Because we, like Montague said, this is not work that we've just started investing in. This is happening because of the amazing, powerful work that is literally putting their safety, their lives at risk to do this. So really calling on anybody who really believes in this work to support Black leaders, support Black-led organizations, really put your investment where it counts, the fact that we are able to have changes like completely rethinking our police system, completely rethinking what public safety looks like, that is because of Black-led organizing in a huge part that has been working on these things and asking these questions and making these demands for years, for decades. Please, if you can right now, give to any fund. We're gonna have a few different funds that you can support, but this is the one that's really close to my heart. I mean, look, I know what it's like to get a call in the middle of the night. My brother, person of color, stopped and arrested for no reason, you know, having to go in the middle of the night and try to get him out of jail for nothing that he's done, just for being a person of color driving a car. And this isn't stuff like, we can't wake up and say, okay, I don't want to think about this today. I don't want to think about the color of my skin or my family today. So with that, I want to introduce Laura, who is our state advisor in Minnesota, where so much of the current protest uprising started. And I want Laura to tell us a little bit about what's happening in Minnesota, where they're completely, they are disbanding the police. They are rethinking what public safety looks like. So thank you so much, Laura. I'm really looking forward to having all of us here. Your perspective as someone who's been doing the work in Minnesota.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hello to everyone from semi-liberated Minneapolis. I'm here and it's been quite a month here. I live about 12 blocks from where George Floyd was murdered. So my street has become kind of a wayfare of people coming and going from the memorial site at all times. It's been really surreal to go through this, because this is a very local event to us in our neighborhoods here, in our city and in our state. But then to try to take in the international dimensions of this has been sort of like, there was a night while we were experiencing, you know, hearing the flashbangs and the tear gas and the fires not very far from our house, talking to my daughter and explaining to her that a million people were demonstrating in Berlin about this. And she was like, what? You know, like, so we had no way to see what would happen. Like when that mural that's in the photo that Elizabeth started with, when that went up, like we watched that go up, and the woman who painted it helped us do a mural at my kid's school 2 years ago. And now it's like this iconic image. So we're sort of at the heart of this, but really for us, it's about our neighborhoods, our blocks, and the geography of our city has never been so apparent. Like I say that I'm 12 blocks from where George Floyd was killed, but safety has been measured block by block. So I'm five blocks outside of where the fires hit, and that's been a lot of safety for me and my family, and much less so each block you move closer and closer into the heart of the city, where the damage and the ongoing violence of state-sponsored violence against people of color carried out by our policing has been happening. So anyway, it was no accident that this happened in Minneapolis. So this is a reckoning, as Montague was saying, that has been long overdue, both because Minneapolis, by any measure that racism can be sort of calculated, we are always at the top of the list in terms of disparities for wealth, you know, educational outcomes, home ownership, and incarceration, with Black people taking the brunt of our carceral state here. At the same time, we have this deep, profound, powerful movement for Black lives that goes back decades, but that especially took hold in 2015 in the wake of the Jamar Clark murder, and continued through all the organizing after Philando Castile was murdered, and then Thurman Blevins last year, and now George Floyd. And a part of that organizing is also driven by really powerful demographic change that we're seeing in this city. We have a young generation of people of color coming of age in this city. The city is now 40% POC. while the state remains like 80–85% white. So we have young Latinx youth, we have Native American youth, we have Somali and other East African youth who are at the heart of this movement, joining forces with African American organizers who've been doing this work and leading in our state for generations. And actually, thinking of history, it's important to note that AIM, the American Indian Movement, was founded in Minneapolis in 1968 in response to police violence. That was actually the cause of the whole creation of that movement. So we're sort of feeling the power and the history of all of that as we are in this moment of uprising in Minneapolis. And I think you all know kind of a lot of, I'm not going to go over everything that happened, but I just wanted to underline that amidst this uprising, with all of this incredible violence coming from the police and the state, we've also had this incredible feeling of abundance here on the ground, where there's an outpouring of mutual aid, some of which had started in response to COVID. So some of that structure was already there. Many organizations that MVP supports were also supporting their membership, especially immigrants and undocumented people who were outside of any kind of state aid. So that mutual aid structure existed, and for young people, students who were kicked off their campuses, and they were able to sort of meet the uprising moment and create like a daily, I mean, I would say there have been at least 12 sites where people can get food free, huge grocery drop-off sites, medical assistance, and then this incredible sort of passing of the hat that happened between organizations as we were getting financial support from across the country. Like money was coming into Minneapolis, everyone was wanting to help the organizers on the ground. With incredible generosity, people passed the hat. They said, we've got enough, please donate to this group or these 10 other groups, and moving down to groups that weren't getting a lot of attention. And that's been like, that's now kind of a tradition, I would say, among our ecosystem of organizing. That's been really beautiful to see. And then also there's this incredible community self-defense that emerged in response to the violence and the lack of, I mean, the police were just basically defending their precincts, that's it. And the fire department was not answering calls and the city was burning. So overnight, literally, the citizens of Minneapolis organized themselves to defend their neighborhoods. We had, you know, we had hoses out front. We were all in groups, meeting in the alleys, going through the alleys, looking for flammables, which people were finding. We had, you know, a real attack by groups who came here to do damage to the city. And part of what came out of that then was the recognition of what actually keeps us safe, who keeps us safe. You know, the police were no longer answering calls, even to people who were willing to still call them. And for a lot of white people, it was a real wake up of like, this, you know, they aren't really here for us either. So that's been like a major breakthrough. And I'm talking about like, I'm just like in conversation with my neighbors, most of whom are homeowners, and having this really deep conversation. Why do we need them? Like, do we need an armed response if someone breaks into our garage? You know, like, no, actually, what if someone came out and helped us with lighting and locks and did a little, and connected us to people in the neighborhood and told us what was going on? That could be really great. So that's the conversation that's happening right now in Minneapolis. And there's many other, you know, mental health calls, people who have OD'd. Right now, you literally, if you see someone who needs help, you call 911, and even if you say, I don't want a police response, the police are gonna come. So people are all over the city asking the question, what do we do instead? Who do we call? How do we help each other? So we are in the midst of a vast conversation about that, and the sort of tumult that has already happened has enabled that. Like, that conversation wouldn't have been possible without the kind of, without the uprising, without the leadership of really Black young people who took to the streets and then articulated a vision around divest, invest, and defunding the police. And that led to then this amazing event on the 7th of June on a Sunday in Powderhorn Park, Prince's birthday, thousands of people gathered in our city council. A veto-proof majority of the city council announced that they were prepared to take measures to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. The event was organized by Black Visions Collective, which is the BLM chapter here in Minneapolis, and Reclaim the Block, which was a group of activists who'd been organizing for a long time to defund the police. And previous to this, I would say their demand was to cut 10% of the police budget, and they couldn't get that passed. And now we're talking about dismantling the entire police. So the speed of change is really mind-boggling. And, you know, everyone's not down with it. You know, this is complicated stuff. Like even in the North Side, which is majority Black, there are real deep conversations have to go on right now with business owners, older people, because what it means to dismantle the police is not yet clear. And so I think that what's most important is that the city of Minneapolis actually have some space and opportunity to have a real conversation. This is not like conversation at the door to like get people to vote a certain way. This is very deep and exploratory, and to really, so we need that space. Fortunately, our city council seems to be prepared to create that space to have this conversation over the next year. They are and that's an outcome of organizing and electoral work. So some of the people on that city council were elected in 2017 as a direct result of the first wave of organizing in 2015. And for a couple of years, it was very frustrating to see they were elected, but we didn't see change. Now we have this movement moment, but because they're in office, we can possibly really, really make the most of it. So it is, as I think Elizabeth said at the top, this is a proof of our theory that this works. You have to have the people in the place when the moment comes that you can actually make change. So they have, the city council today or tomorrow is going to put forward a charter amendment, which would go on, hopefully on the ballot this November, in which the city of Minneapolis voters will be asked whether they want to change the city charter to allow us not to have policing in the way we've had it in the past. And right now, the city is required to have a certain number of police officers per citizen. And unless we change the charter, we really have no space to try out all of the different experiments that we're talking about. So that charter amendment would be the first step. And we'll know within, I don't know, a couple of weeks whether we can actually get it on the ballot, but that's sort of the direction we're hoping to go. And then in the next 3 months, we're going to have so many conversations with our neighbors and friends about this. And that's where the groups that MVP supports are really critical. Both the Black Lives Matter groups like Black Visions Collective and Reclaim the Block, but also some of our other partners like Take Action Minnesota and Faith in Minnesota, who have contact with many people all over the state and can really lead those conversations at a broader scale across the state. And so we're looking forward to that. We're also aware that the situation is highly volatile, that this is controversial, that how this reads outside of the city can be damaging. There's been an uptick in shootings in the city, and that's really scary. And that also is, you know, informing people's sense of safety. Republicans in the state Senate have attempted to use this, obviously, as they're going to all over the country, to polarize and to terrify people. The head of the state Senate at one point said, suburban mothers are owed an apology for being frightened by this whole, you know, all the riots. And Faith in Minnesota got this great hashtag trending, I'm a suburban mom. And basically it was white suburban women posting, and actually not all white, suburban women, moms posting, I'm in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I want to defend Black life. I support the demonstrators and the movement. So, and actually it trended nationally. So that is the kind of work that we also need to do to support the movement right here in the center of Minneapolis, in the suburbs, in the state, in the rural areas, and nationally, to have a conversation about a multiracial response to this that really emphasizes cross-racial solidarity. So that's the work that folks are doing here. I think one of the reasons we are really keeping our eye on Minnesota is that 10% of the vote in Wisconsin is in the Twin Cities media market. So they're just right across the river and they're watching the news here every night. So it really is going to matter how this all plays out. And we MVP are doing everything we can to make sure our partners have the resources to do the narrative and messaging work to create a really positive picture of this experiment for everyone who's watching. So, and that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to pass back to Elizabeth. Thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Alex, and we can go to the next slide. I think it's bringing up the Black-led organizing fund. Yeah, and I just you know, I am just blown away by the ability to imagine a criminal justice system that doesn't victimize Black people, that doesn't victimize people of color. And I'm really grateful to see the visionary work being done by some of the amazing groups. I know Faith in Minnesota helped lead just a talking session where literally people in the community were talking about, okay, what are new systems of justice? What are new systems of care that we could really do? Like EMTs and ambulances, for example, they came about because originally they were sending police officers even when somebody got injured, and they, let me tell you, were not being very kind to the Black neighborhoods when they had a medical emergency. I think it's really important. I mean, I have had cops scream at me that they can arrest us if we don't show them their papers. Like I'm very happy that people who are white, frankly, are able to see some of the real fear and loss of safety that a lot of people of color and a lot of Black people we face every single day when we have to interact with law enforcement. You know, in Florida we had when I was living in Miami, amazing, powerful Black behavioral therapist was trying to protect you know, just a man with autism, you know, developmentally disabled man with autism, literally on the floor, like his hands up on his stomach, just saying, please don't shoot him. He has a toy in his hand. Please don't shoot him. I'm his behavioral therapist. And the police shot him. Like they shot the behavioral therapist on the floor with his hands up. And when he asked the police officer, literally bleeding on the floor, why did you shoot me? The officer said, I don't know. And that, you can be doing nothing wrong and be killed by the police. So if you can, please support this organizing. And I want to move us into some of the overarching voter suppression and pivoting in the pandemic that's really going to need to be done to have change happen from the bottom up, from every single level, from judges that we have a lot of our partners are actually organizing around judges, organizing around district attorneys, organizing around sheriffs. So it's way more than the presidential election that's on the ballot, and way more power shifting that needs to happen than just at the top. So Alex, if you could move us to the next slide. Thank you. So Reema is our Wisconsin State Advisor, and I know she wants to start off with a video just to show us. So Wisconsin was an amazing progressive victory in the middle of a pandemic where the GOP was actually testing out their voter suppression tactics. And really what happened was the groups were pivoting from preparedness. It's not like they were sitting there on their hands. They were making change happen. And so I'll leave it to you, Reema. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, we're gonna run this video, I think, really quickly. Right. So I'm here to talk to y'all a little bit about the April 7th execution, election that we had out here in Wisconsin. We were the first state, and I think I'm echoing a little bit, so I'm going to put my headphones on and see if that helps. We were the first state in the country to hold an election during this pandemic. And when we talk about voter suppression, can folks hear me all right now? I heard I was getting feedback. Great. When we talk about election suppression, one of the biggest ways that we saw this happen on April 7th was that the pandemic itself was weaponized, and it was weaponized on the backs of Black and brown communities and denser parts of the state, like in Milwaukee, like in Madison. Folks have probably heard this, so I may sound like a broken record, but in Milwaukee alone, the city of Milwaukee, we went from over 180 polling sites on election day to just 5. And that's why you saw lines that were this long. And again, lines during a pandemic, lines where people maybe could not maintain, CDC recommendations on distancing, lines where folks maybe didn't have PPE. And what we also saw was suppression in how voters were able or not to vote absentee. One of the ways that this shows up is that in Wisconsin, in order to vote absentee, you're required to have a witness signature. This person must be a US citizen. So if you have mixed status households, if you live alone, at times folks had to jeopardize their health. And again, CDC guidelines on how to keep safe during this extremely infectious disease and leave their homes in order to obtain a signature from a qualified person. And possibly the biggest way that voter suppression showed up during this past election was in misinformation. The last 2 weeks before the election, including on election eve itself, saw dozens of changes in whether, how, and when voting would happen. So all of this is to say, let's be very clear. What happened in Wisconsin was not an aberration, but a foreshadowing of things to come in states all across the country come November. And we're already seeing this in some of the states that have had elections since April. So what are we doing about it? Elizabeth already said this, we're pivoting from preparedness, and I have to give so many props to my colleagues, Montague and Laura, who pointed out the ways in which the grassroots groups that MVP works with have been doing this work for years. And so when we talk about being able to pivot in this moment, know that this pivoting is coming because groups have been organizing. They have been connecting with community and with their members, and are able to, what seems like on a dime, be able to put forward what are their legislative asks to their city councils or to their state elected officials and federal government. So we're able to do this because organizations have been pivoting and preparing.
That's so great, huh?
And specifically, what are groups doing right now? I'm going to uplift 3 major tactics that groups are employing. First is adapting programs and shifting what the metrics and tactics look like. So not only are we beefing up digital organizing, and you'll see this, one of my, one of the groups that frequently show up on my timeline is LIT, Leaders Igniting Transformation. They're on TikTok, they're on Instagram, Facebook, educating voters on what is happening right now. They're one of the Black-led organizations that has specifically been doing work during this uprising to defund police right here in Milwaukee. And one of the partner groups, the African American Roundtable, they were previously asking for a $25 million cut to the police budget in Milwaukee, and because of the momentum of this time, they've upped that to $75 million. They're saying we need to make sure that instead of us funding this arcane system, we need to fund our schools, we need to fund for mental health, we need to help out the people in our city and our state instead of criminalizing them. So not only are folks adapting their programs around issue agendas, but they're also adding an absentee education component. Because if folks are not familiar with absentee voting, out here in Wisconsin, the process is, 1, you have to be registered to vote. So once you're registered, you can request, you have to submit a ballot request form. This is something you can do online or send it through snail mail. And then come election season, you'll receive a ballot in the mail. You have to fill it out, again, get that witness signature. from someone other than yourself who is a US citizen, and then submit it in the mail. So there is a multi-step process here. So one of the programs that almost all of our partners are instituting during this time, leading up to the election in November, is they're going to be doing ballot chase programs. So we actually just had a decision earlier this week. The Wisconsin Election Commission decided to mail out absentee ballot request forms to all registered voters in Wisconsin. This is a really great and big win. So now you'll have over 3 million people receiving ballot request forms in the mail, but there still is that process of them submitting those forms to get their ballots, and then once they receive their ballots, mailing those back in. And again, that's where our partners will critically be showing up to move that process forward. Another way that we are pivoting from preparedness is understanding where our electorate is at. So much mutual aid happened during the 2 weeks leading up to the election, because as our partners were reaching out to voters, as folks, organizers with Block and Lit and Voces, just to name a few, were calling and texting their members, what they were hearing is that folks lost their jobs and didn't know how to apply for unemployment, that folks didn't know where to get food, and do they know where the local food pantry is, that people were just really scared and did not have information on what they could do to get questions answered, whether that was, again, around food scarcity, mental health, unemployment. And so we need to also understand where our communities are at when we are doing this outreach. And it is a testament to the type of groups that MVP funds, these grassroots groups that work inside and outside of election cycles, that are trusted messengers, that they are not only able to provide education and mobilize folks during the election, but able to also meet these needs, very human needs of folks as we are reaching out to them. And then the final area that I'll uplift right now is around election administration. And out here in Wisconsin, I saw that there were some questions around this. Election administration and election suppression work is being handled by a number of groups, but most of them are either at the C3 or at the C4 table. So we're talking about Wisconsin Voices or America Votes. Up until this point, it's been mostly within the C3 space, but there are conversations of how C4 organizations can better show up and plug into this work too, and those are ongoing. But one of the things that we realized was that there's a lot that municipalities could do to expand early voting above and beyond what is happening at our state level. Because if you don't already know this, in Wisconsin, our state government is controlled by Republicans. Yes, we have a Democratic governor, but we have a majority in the state House and the state Senate, a conservative majority. And even though we won, thankfully, I wish I had some wood to knock on, but even though we won in the Supreme Court race in April 7th, we still have a conservative majority in our Wisconsin Supreme Court too. So there isn't always a lot that can be done at the state level, but municipalities have a lot that they can do to expand early voting access, whether that's days, times, sites. We had some municipalities in I should say Madison and Racine, that allowed folks to do drive-up voting. So again, this is not something that is administered at the state level, but that local municipalities can do. And we have partner organizations out here at the C3 and C4 table that are pushing this work to ensure that municipalities do everything they can to expand voter access. And the other thing I'll say about this too is that we still need to protect election day voting. We're looking at, we're anticipating anywhere between 30 to 50% of the electorate is going to still vote on election day. So we want to make sure that this is safe. And how are we doing this? Groups are looking at everything from filling up election admin positions, polling site positions with folks from their networks, to also having safe voting teams that can pass out PPE at polling sites and water and sanitizers while folks wait in line. So again, this is a testament to the deeply rooted nature of the partners that we're working with, that they are thinking not only of this election, but about the well-being of our communities moving well beyond this election. And the last thing I'll say for folks who are very nerdy and thinking about Wisconsin is we do have a hearing, an election lawsuit that's coming up next week, where we will be hopefully what will be litigated is the extent to which we can make changes to voting, absentee voting in Wisconsin, stuff like removing the witness signature, extending deadlines so people can have their ballot postmarked by election day. But we've seen how, unfortunately, our postal office is just overburdened. And so one of the things up to be litigated is expanding the deadline for which return ballots can be counted up to 10 days after the election. So a lot of work happening out here. I know there's a lot happening in other states too, so I'll turn it back to Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reema. I thank you so much. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and Wisconsin in a lot of ways is kind of showing us the way, and now a lot of other states are having to really face the exact same tactics that they used in Wisconsin. I want to introduce Myrna. Thank you. And Myrna is our Director of State and Local Partnerships, just an absolutely amazing person who just does such incredible work. And I know, Myrna, you wanted to start us off with a video, right, showing what's happening,
Yes.
what happened in Georgia, correct?
Kentucky. Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. And I wanted to kind of just start off the presentation with this because it really kind of captures some of the realities of what's happening with our communities during our current elections and primaries. I was following what was happening in Kentucky yesterday, on Tuesday, and really kind of enraged that this had to happen, right? That people actually that were in line by 6 p.m. to vote got locked out of being able to do so until a court injunction kind of came through. But I was really upset. I was worried about November. I was just like mad about how voter suppression is ripping through our country right now. And how in some places they're using everything that's happening right now to really try to cut off access for our communities. So I wanted to bring that up because while it really angered me, I was also just really inspired by the grit and the courage and the tenacity of people banging on that door. People wanting to make their voice heard at the ballot box, people lining up hours ahead to make sure that their voice was counted and that they would also be able to vote. This was in Kentucky. There was only one voting place in Jefferson County where there are about over 600,000 registered voters, and it also happens to be the place where at least half of Black Kentuckians live. As of today, the winner hasn't been declared in that primary, and they'll likely have to wait at least a week or so, as was the case in Pennsylvania when they didn't find out until 10 days later who won the race. And so this is a system that's getting harder to trust when you don't know what the outcome is, when people aren't being allowed to vote. But this is exactly what our communities are facing every day. But there's hope, throughout this and just being able to see that video. Our people are on the ground documenting all of these instances. Every week I get to talk to amazing individuals and groups that are fighting the suppression, but also preparing their communities to vote safely and with all of the correct information to do so, and putting their all in and day out to make sure our democracy is working for everyone in their communities and their states. So what are some of our groups doing now that they're voting in this pandemic? And Reema covered a lot of some of those great things, but they're doing kind of 4 basic things. They're pivoting their plans. They're working at the county and state level for election protection and fighting some of this voter suppression that we're seeing day by day. They're preparing for more rapid responses and safe voting. And they're continuing to build trust, build base, and making sure that they continue to stay ready in their community. So I believe the PowerPoint is still showing, but how are they pivoting their plan, right? So there's 3 main pieces to this pandemic pivot plan. They're continuing to engage voters. They're pivoting in this crisis, and they're upgrading their organizing. throughout the work in engaging voters, we know that this is not easy. In a lot of places, people had to wait to find out what day their primary was going to be, how they could vote, where they could vote, right? In a state like Kentucky that had and Georgia that had over 3,200 polling places, they went down to less like to way less than half of that. And so keeping up with the constant changes and information is one of the things that organizers on the ground and groups that we support are having to make sure they stay on top of, to give voters and their communities the correct information to be able to accurately vote. So they're continuing to register voters and making sure that they push out online voter registration if that's available, continuing with the voter education, which is critical with the rapidly changing vote practices in their state, making sure that people know how they can request absentee ballots, how they can vote by mail. And as organizations, they're also pivoting their plans and adapting new plans. Many of you were part of our pandemic response fund, where we were able to give out over $1 million in grants to groups to get the technological tools that they need to be able to shift in this pandemic, which is adopting new tools that allow them to make phone calls or text messages, or even giving them access to Zoom technology so that they're able to have community-wide meetings with their members and their communities, and making sure that they take their work online, from the canvases to the texting and the phone banks. And they're also upgrading some of their just organizing as a whole, right? The election administration, Reema showed us about growing their volunteer networks, hiring more staff to support elections, training them. And a lot of our partners have also been engaging in legal work and legal battles to either file lawsuits, injunctions, or make sure that people in their places, in their communities, have the right to vote. They're doing this through working at the county and state level for some of that election protection. In Georgia, for example, our partners, New Georgia Project, have filed a lawsuit in response to absentee ballots being sent in only one language in Gwinnett County. Gwinnett County is the second largest and one of the most diverse counties in Georgia, to make sure that folks have access to ballots in Spanish or in another language, so that the communities actually know what's on there and can vote and make informed decisions about what's going to be on their ballot. They've also been working to recruit poll workers and make sure to document all instances of any restrictions to voting or voter suppression. This last cycle, groups in Georgia had a phone bank line that people could call and register stories of instances in where they couldn't vote or issues that they were having. The last election, they received about 1,000 calls, but on this past primary, they received over 4,000 calls from people not being able to vote, not being able to do what they needed to do on the day of. But even with all of this, because of the amazing work of our partners on the ground and thousands of grassroots organizers, voter turnout was still up over 300% from 2016. So we know people want to vote. We know they want to do that, and our communities are really out there trying to make sure that they have everything that they need to be able to do so. They're also preparing for more rapid responses and safe voting, right? When mail-in ballots or voting from home is not an option, our state of Texas just a couple of weeks ago said that COVID-19 was not a reason for people to request mail from home ballots. So we know that a lot of people are going to have to go out there at risk and make their voices heard come November. But know that many of our partners, like Advanced Carolina, are sending out one-time vote safe PPE kits that include a mask, gloves, sanitizer to folks, to make sure that if they do have to go out, if they have to show up at the polls, which we want them to do, that they're doing so in a safe way. Because we know that many of the communities that we work with and that we represent are communities that are at risk for COVID. One of the partners that I was talking to in Arizona this past week, Lucha, who is a powerhouse in the state, mentioned mentioned that over half of their staff currently have COVID. So when talking about figuring out if they're going to go back onto the field, they have to do so safely, are not planning to do so just yet, are doing their work online, but are preparing and making sure that they are preparing their community to vote safely. And continuing to do that work by building trust and building that base and staying ready with their communities, right? So another thing that our groups are doing and how they're changing in all of this is that they're scenario planning. What does it look like if there aren't a lot of spikes here? When could we go out and do canvasses? And if that's not going to be an option, what do dropping off ballot information pieces look like for folks? How do we scale up our mail programs to make sure that we're able to mail correct information when sometimes, you know, our own county election boards aren't sending out the right things. I know that in Georgia, absentee ballots were sent out with wrong information and different things are happening. So our communities have to meet that need, send out correct information, correct polling places, information that goes out in appropriate languages to their community. And so they're scenario planning. They're getting ready to be able to do that with their communities and continuing to engage them and connecting issues all around their communities with building their base, right? So if people are struggling with housing insecurity, mutual aid networks, they're being providers, they're stepping up to the plate, meeting that need in their communities and building that trust. That's really going to help them be able to continue to engage new people and turn them out during election time. They're also hosting town halls virtually with our help and the help of various other organizations and making sure that they collect that information to be able to text them and say, hey, remember elections are this day, this is where your voting place is going to be. Do you have any questions about what's on the ballot? And being their go-to source for that information when unfortunately sometimes local government isn't stepping up to the plate and making sure that people have what they need to be able to vote. I'll also tell you that a lot of this isn't cheap, right? Many people say, well, now that folks can't go out on the field, you know, costs are going to go down for some of the organizations, and that's actually not the case. What I'm seeing across the board, talking to all of our partners in different states, is that the cost of digital and having their folks be able to do phone banks and digital banks is actually sometimes significantly higher. The cost of making sure that they break through the crowded space that is now social and ads and other pieces is actually much higher than it was before. Some of our folks, because of the fact that primaries have been moved, have endured longer times that they have to run their GOTV programming, like in Pennsylvania when the primary was pushed back by 6 weeks. That meant that our partners had to keep doing GOTV work, had to keep informing people about the changes for an extra 6 weeks than what they had initially allocated for, and thus rising costs to be able to keep those types of programs going. So our partners are ready, they're adapting, they're making sure that they have, the communities have what they need and are doing so in a really amazing and powerful way, but they need our support to be able to continue doing that. We've been in the process with our state teams of collecting information from all of our folks and how we can be more supportive and what their needs are and just how they continue to do this amazing work. So happy to continue sharing that, but I'm going to leave you with the fact that in Kentucky, you know, we have a really close primary and it's now down to less than 2,000 votes and who's going to be the challenger in November. And it's really exciting to see that all of the communities, especially all of those folks that were banging on the door, will be able to have their voice heard. And that's exactly what our partners are making sure is able to happen on the ground. And I know each and every one needs your support because we're doing the work for November and hope that folks can continue to count on yours to do ours. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Elizabeth and thank you for everything that y'all have done so far.
Thank you so much, Myrna. I really appreciate your work so much. And I wanna go back to the slides, Alex. So we are actually still fundraising for our pandemic election fund. The pandemic hasn't gone anywhere in states like Arizona, in Texas, in Florida, where I'm at right now. You know, they're breaking records for the number of cases. And I mean, hearing that an organization like Lucha has half their staff having to deal with the impact of COVID-19 personally, you know, they still need our help. And if you want to help support the work for these groups that are having to work through this pandemic, who are having to continue to pivot, who are having to continue to retrain staff in the face of these constantly changing circumstances, please do movement.vote/pandemic fund. And I want to move us into some hope here, and have Caro talking about the DACA decision. And so, Alex, if you could move us to the next slide. Thank you. So Caro is our Deputy Director of State and Local Partnerships, and she's going to be talking about the two most recent SCOTUS decisions that were actually victories, but keep in mind that they're actually quite small victories at the end of the day. And I know Caro has a lot of details about what's at stake and what we still need to keep fighting for.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Hi, everyone. Caro here with the State Partnerships team, and want to share, you know, that for a couple of years now, actually, many of our local partners at MVP really across the country have been bracing to hear what the Supreme Court was going to say in terms of the employment protections for LGBTQ folks and DACA for immigrant folks. There were two historic decisions that took place last week. On Monday, the Supreme Court affirmed 6-3 that employers cannot unfairly fire or discriminate against LGBTQ folks in the workplace. And this would directly impact more than 11 million gay, lesbian, bisexual folks and 1.5 million trans folks living in this country. So I just want to take that in because this is also the month in which marks the 5 years since the court's historic marriage equality decision. And I think we've mentioned it before, right? LGBTQ organizers and allies have been working on these kind of protections for decades. Really in deep gratitude for the folks that continue to be in the trenches and working to continue to further these protections. And really what this means for members of our team and our movement, and first I actually do want to shout out the fact that a lot of our local organizers have been digging in deep, including Fair Wisconsin, Equality North Carolina, out from Minnesota, which in fact was the first group that passed non-discrimination ordinance in the country, and groups like the Trans Education Network of Texas, continue to organize and dig deep. And this is at a time when nearly half the states in this country still have no legal protections for LGBTQ employees. At a time we're in the middle of a pandemic when healthcare is so important, and at a moment when LGBTQ folks of color, particularly Black transgender women, are facing higher levels of discrimination and often violence. So while the Supreme Court goes a long way in reaffirming legal protections in education, housing, and healthcare, really what we have at stake is 27 states that still have no statewide protections for folks around housing and other public accommodations. LGBTQ folks still facing discrimination on federally funded programs, including access to hospitals, colleges. Our trans community still affected because Trump reversed both the trans housing support as well as trans health protections the week before that. And trans youth in schools are still under attack, denied basic access to extracurricular activities. And so, this, in connecting with folks on the ground, they have shared, yes, this is a watershed moment for LGBTQ folks, and organizations at this point are still saying the fight continues. Focusing in on state elections is going to be key, calling on state legislatures to enact non-discrimination protections, and continuing the momentum for the Equality Act in Congress in the next year. So really want to ground us there, as well as the second historic victory that took place last week, which is that the Supreme Court rejected Trump's attempt to end the DACA program in a decision 5-4. a community-led victory of Black, Brown, API, LGBTQ, Muslim, young folks, and allies to protect from deportation immigrants, including myself, members of this team, and countless of our movement leaders who are out there in the digital space and organizing on the daily. And so last week, if you were in the digital space, you saw folks were in celebration, and a special shout out to folks in the Home is Here Coalition, including United We Dream, NACASEC, who organizes in Korean communities, the Florida Immigrant Coalition, and Lucha in Arizona, because they have been throwing down, celebrating the fact that this decision of DACA restores the program completely. Of course, more work is still to be done, but honestly, I'm still in shock and deep gratefulness that this is a decision that the Supreme Court made, especially knowing the composition of this current court. And so what this means right now is that up to 700,000 DACA recipients are protected from deportation, including 20,000 health workers. And still there is no pathway to citizenship, no permanent solutions yet. So continuous organizing is important to call for permanent solutions that also do not harm immigrant communities. And so folks are really looking at House Bill 6, American Dream and Promise Act. And as folks in our local teams are really providing information right now about what these decisions mean, they're using this as an organizing opportunity, deepening efforts to really tackle the racist criminal system that harms Black and Brown bodies, and making sure that in this process, continuing to center and uplift Black organizers in their leadership for this work. So what's at stake? The Trump administration can still remove the DACA program. He's already signaled intention to go after it multiple times. Deportations still continue. People are still dying in detention centers, and the criminalization of Black communities still continue. And yet there is a rising energy in this country to fight at the state and local level. Addressing racism and anti-Blackness in immigrant spaces is deepening at a pace that, to me, makes me so excited as we continue to create spaces for more anti-racism conversations. The push for local policies to tackle the criminal system and the immigration system. Folks are calling on the defunding of police, ICE, and CBP. So, and the fact is that folks are organizing voters to show up for the races that elect sheriffs, county commissioners, representatives at the state level, so that they can be champions of these issues and hold them accountable after the elections are won. I was part of a generation of young folks that were politicized because our lives were deeply affected and under attack. Right now, we're seeing a whole new generation of folks, and not just young folks, but folks all over the country that are taking up this moment and going into the digital streets. So our support, your support, is going to be really important in this moment. Our communities, Black, Brown, API, Muslim, Arab, South Asian, young folks continue to build power at this very moment to live a life of dignity for all of us. So thank you for your time, and I'm gonna add in the chat some of the organizations I mentioned so you keep them in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caro. I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. I'm very, very happy, very, very happy to have some victories in a time when there is so much crisis around us. Like my wife and I watched this decision, just like the LGBTQ decision, just totally in shock. We were so prepared for the absolute worst. I know, and I used to work with Florida Immigrant Coalition. I know so many in our immigrant communities are feeling the exact same thing, just utter shock that we can actually win. But you know what? That just shows that we need to dream big. We need to keep dreaming, and we need to keep thinking about what's possible. And on that celebratory tone, I want to move us to Andrea Catone, who is our Director of Donor Organizing, to talk about fundraising goals and updates, because we've got some good ones.
Yes, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I appreciate being pass things over when we're talking about that dreaming big and that hope, because We can't do that without everyone that's here on this call. And before I move forward, I just want to say how inspired and grateful and honored I am to work with my brilliant colleagues at MVP and to be part of such a leaderful team. On the next slide, you'll see that Elizabeth said we have some exciting news. Back in 2018, we set our 2019 and 2020 goal of $50 million. And at that time, we already knew that we needed to raise more, but that number was much, much more than we'd ever raised before. 2020 is here, and we know concretely that the need is way greater than we originally projected. And those gaps and needs are what you learned about today, and we're getting close to that goal, but we do know that much more is needed. And on the next slide, I want to zoom into some of the gaps that still exist and show them to you presented here. And these gaps are what is guiding our current discussions about raising our goal. So we can step up to what is needed along with our amazing team. We need each of you. And I want to point out that these are not just numbers, and these are not just goals. These needs and gaps represent the amazing work that's being done across the country that you learned about today. And we can't close these gaps without you. We need you, and in just a moment, I'm gonna share how you can step up and how you can help. But before I do that, I wanna move us to the next slide, and I wanna wholeheartedly thank everyone that's on this call and the more than 9,000 other people who have donated this cycle and have allowed us to move millions of dollars to organizers and groups across the country. We need to get ready, though, to not only give, to meet these goals, to meet these gaps, but we have to organize, right? Like, we learned about all this amazing organizing that's happening on the ground today, but we all on this call need to organize together. And we not only need to organize, but we need to organize with the passion, the imperative, and the love that mirrors what organizers on the ground are bringing to this work. We owe it to them, we owe it to each other, and we owe it to generations to come. And on the next slide, I want to show a few different ways that you can get started to do more. And it may be the case that you joined us today and you're moved by what you heard. If you can just go back one more slide. You may be moved by what you learned today, but you may also be new to MVP and have a ton of questions. And if this is you, the next best step is for you to join one of our MVP 101 sessions that are scheduled all the way out through October. And if you have been supporting MVP and may not need this session, these sessions are the perfect fit for all the folks that you're organizing in your networks to give. So please spread the word and share. You can visit movement.vote/events to register. And let's move into action together. I want to talk just a little bit about how together we can not only make an impact, but also multiply that impact exponentially. So the first thing to do is to give. Give now. We need it now. As Billy said at this onset of this call, it's time. It's election time. And we want to encourage you that you can also talk with an MVP advisor and start making your plan for not only the rest of this year, but next year and the years beyond. And if you need to be connected with one of our amazing advisors, you can reach out to advisor@movement.vote. The next thing you can do is also do a virtual house party. And just to let you know, we've moved over $2 million this cycle via house parties and also virtual house parties. So the beauty of the virtual house parties and an upside to us being constrained in this way in our engagement with one another is that you can invite your friends and network nationally and not just the people in town, and you don't have to clean up the wine and cheese and everything afterwards. We'll get you set up and ready to go. If you're interested in organizing or co-hosting an event, you can reach out to Adriana at movement.vote. You can also become an organizer. As I just said, this is one of the most important things you can do. If you have a network of people of means and you want to reach out to your friends or family and organize them to move money to MVP groups, we can support you. We have monthly workshops, we have materials, and we have coaching. So come on, join us, get started. And if you want to do that, you can email david@movement.vote. And last, testify. Once you give, share about it on social media, tell your friends and family via email or when you talk with them next. And I want to emphasize, we can't do this without all of you, and we want you to join us. Let's organize together, and let's do this. And as Billy said, to not only get through all these scary parts right now, but to move towards the hope, to build on the preparedness and the work of the organizers on the ground that we support. Let's do it for them. Let's do it for each other. Let's do it together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you. I really appreciate this. And I want to open us up. I know we're over time. I want to give us a few minutes for some questions and answers. I know folks, feel free to ask in the chat, and I've also got a few questions here. So I love this one. In addition to financial support, how can local coalitions support voter suppression orgs on the ground in Wisconsin, Michigan? Should we go to the groups and contact them? So, Caro, do you wanna field that question as some of the best ways that people can help the groups directly?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think folks can, one of the key things that folks have told us, different local partners, has been definitely funding support is top, is super, super needed priority. So definitely want to dig in there. But I would say that some of the places where we are also inviting folks to connect, additionally, are organizations who can connect to folks that are fielding and supporting volunteers in these efforts. So organizations like Swing Left definitely come to mind to connect with. And in addition to that, I mean, I would just mention that there are local folks. If you are local to Minnesota and Wisconsin, definitely connecting, I think, with folks on the ground is going to be really great. There are organizations who are constantly looking for support for volunteering in the efforts for addressing voter suppression and GOTV work. So definitely want to encourage folks to do some time in connecting with folks there as well. I'm not sure if Reema or Laura have any pieces to add, particularly since they're in Wisconsin or Minnesota.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I think I do want to be as respectful as possible to people's time. So one last question here. Looking for specific ideas about opportunities to do effective volunteer work during the next 4 months regarding GOTV and election protection. Are there any good ones? So Caro, if you want to answer that, that would be great. And I also want to suggest to folks that you can go to movement.vote and see lists of our partners. They're all over the country. They're in, I believe, in every single state. And you can reach out to those groups and see how you can help them as well.
Definitely. I mean, I think I want to dig in there for sure. I think a lot of folks who want to be supportive and volunteer are welcome to connect with local folks on the ground. I know that there is a huge need right now for folks to support in as poll workers. So I know some of our organizations are constantly looking for volunteers who can take some time and do that. And I mean, overall, I would just reaffirm, definitely there's amazing efforts in places like Florida where there's a statewide kind of collaborative to come together and address this voter suppression. And one of the key things that they are asking for right now is just continuously fundraising for that, as they are just really trying to dig in and make sure that they have ample local folks on the ground to be able to address that. So definitely just want to dig in there.
Thank you so much, Caro. And I also want, in the chat, I want to lift up our Dying for Democracy partnership. If you go to www.dyingfordemocracy.com, it's a really fun way to give and kind of invite people on the first Fridays. Restaurants all over the country, you can order from them and donate to MVP. And we're really excited about that partnership. All of the funding is going to go directly to our groups. And as you can see from this call, the amazing work happening on the ground is, to me, it's just mind blowing. I always feel so honored to be doing this work and to be able to give my life in service of these local communities. And then I think that we want to go to Billy in the next slide for our closing. Billy?
So I think that Billy is actually having a couple technical difficulties, so I am going to hop back in.
Thank you, Andrea.
And just, you know, build off of what I shared before. We can't do this without you. We need you to step up now. We need you to join us. We need you to join all the folks. Thank you to everyone who's engaged in the chat and shared all the different ways creatively that you are working together to move money to these groups now. We need to do it. Get out the vote time is now. The groups are doing work that needs to be supported now. And we need to not only think about now, but beyond 2020 into 2021. So we encourage you right now to go to movement.vote, learn how to donate, talk with an advisor, host a house party, organize with it. We're here to support you to step up and organize with us. And again, organize with the love, the dedication, the passion, and the imperative that groups on the ground are organizing with today. And thank you so much. And thank you, Elizabeth, for your leadership. And thank you again to all my brilliant colleagues at MVP. We deeply appreciate you. And thank you to everyone who's been with us today. And we look forward to continuing to work with you and making this happen together. So that way, we're not going to only win in 2020, but we're going to get to that progressive decade of the 2020s yet to come. So thank you all. And thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you, everyone. Keep dreaming big. I mean, we're seeing how even in crisis we can dream big and win. Now let's keep dreaming. Let's keep fighting, and let's make 2020s a progressive decade. I know we can do it together. Thank you, everyone.